I used to think that if I worked hard enough, if I kept my head down and didn't complain, my family would eventually see my worth. That belief crumbled the day my mother looked me in the eye and asked me to loan my apartment to my brother so he could have a space to launch his next big idea. Never mind that I spent a decade saving for it. Never mind that it was the only place I'd ever truly called home. What hurt most wasn't the request. It was the expectation. Like my dreams were always optional, but his, non-negotiable. I'm Lena, I'm 31. And this is the story of how my quiet obedience was mistaken for a blank check, and how, when I finally said no, the people who raised me showed me exactly what that unconditional love really meant. My brother Brian is 2 years older than me, and according to my mother, he was born with destiny in his bones. Even as a child, he was labeled as gifted, charismatic, and visionary. Words she never once used for me. He was the golden son. I was the quiet one, the helper, the good girl, the one who didn't cause trouble. Our house wasn't abusive, not in the ways that leave bruises, but it was painfully uneven. When Brian got in trouble at school for talking back to teachers, Mom said he was too creative to be confined. When did I get straight A's? She'd say, "Of course you did, Lena. You're the responsible one," and then move on. That was the dynamic. Brian sparkled, and I balanced the checkbook. By the time we hit high school, the gap between us wasn't just emotional, it was financial. Brian got a new car for his 16th birthday. I inherited my aunt's dented sedan and paid for the insurance myself. He went to a private college out of state with full family funding. I stayed local, juggling 3 part-time jobs and night classes at a state university. College loans build character. My dad said when I asked if they could help with tuition, apparently, that only applied to daughters. What they saw in Brian, I never fully understood. Maybe it was because he talked big, always pitching some new idea, always chasing some bold vision. He started a clothing line in college that tanked in 4 months. Then it was a YouTube channel. Then an app. Then a failed Kickstarter. Each failure came with a new round of sympathy. He's finding himself, they said. He's meant to lead. Meanwhile, I got my architecture degree quietly. I interned without pay for 2 years and lived off canned soup. Eventually, I landed a full-time position and began working my way up the ladder. No celebrations, no balloons, just a text from Mom that said, "Proud of you, sweetie." Now about Brian, he's having a tough time again. The message was always clear: my success was expected. His was celebrated, even when it didn't exist. And I swallowed it, for years. Because I thought that was what good daughters did. You absorb the weight so others can float. You shrink so someone else can shine. But somewhere along the way, I started to notice something dangerous. They didn't just love Brian more. They expected me to love him enough for all of us. Cover his rent if they couldn't. Buy him a suit for his next interview. Sign a loan he had no intention of paying. And every time I said yes, I told myself it was temporary. That one day, they'd see the pattern. That one day, he would change. He didn't. And they didn't want to. I didn't stop loving them for it. Not yet. But I did start investing elsewhere. In late nights at the drafting table. In quiet resilience. In the slow, stubborn act of choosing myself, even when no one else did. I told myself that one day, it would pay off. That if I worked hard enough and stayed quiet long enough, they'd eventually see it. Not just the effort, but the worth behind it. I didn't know then that the more I achieved, the more they'd resent it. And the more they'd expect me to compensate for the son who never learned how to stand on his own. But I'd learn that lesson soon. One boundary at a time. I was 22 when I moved into my first shoebox apartment, barely 400 square feet, with creaky pipes and a window that rattled when it rained. It wasn't much. It wasn't mine, but it was the first space I could call my own. I just graduated with my architecture degree, exhausted, in debt, and juggling 3 jobs just to cover rent. My life was coffee, stained sketches, secondhand furniture, and pasta 5 nights a week. But every square foot of that apartment felt earned. It was a start. Brian, meanwhile, had just dropped out of his second college. He told our parents he needed time to refocus. So they turned the garage into his office and paid for a course on entrepreneurship mindset. I didn't get it then. I thought if I just kept grinding, maybe one day I'd finally earn the kind of belief they gave him freely. At 25, I earned my architecture license. At 27, I became the youngest lead designer in our firm's history. I still remember telling Mom over the phone, waiting for that moment, just one moment, of shared excitement. All I got was, "That's nice, honey." But Brian's really onto something big this time. He's designing custom phone cases with motivational quotes. Isn't that clever? By then, I'd stopped expecting applause. I'd started saving. Quietly, methodically. For something I wasn't even sure I'd ever be able to afford a home. I wasn't looking for luxury. I wanted something that reflected me. Intentional, elevated, quietly bold. After months of searching, I found it, a two-bedroom unit on the 24th floor of a glass and steel tower in the city's design district. Floor-to-ceiling windows, brushed concrete walls, floating oak shelves, and recessed lighting that felt like calm in light form. The kitchen was sleek, with quartz counters and matte, black fixtures. The master bath had a soaking tub angled just right for skyline views at night. It wasn't a penthouse, but it was close. The building had a rooftop lounge, a gym with real equipment, and a lobby that smelled like eucalyptus instead of bleach. It wasn't the kind of place you stumbled into. It was chosen, designed, earned. I remember standing in the middle of the living room, barefoot on wide, plank floors, holding the keys. For once, I didn't feel like a placeholder in someone else's dream. I felt home. Rebecca came over with champagne. We toasted on the balcony as the sun dipped below the skyline. "You built this," she said, clinking her glass against mine. "And no one can take it from you." I wanted to believe that. I wanted to believe it so badly that I did something naive. I invited my family over for dinner. I cooked Mom's favorite rice dish, bought Dad's favorite scotch, stocked Brian's fridge with friendly energy drinks. I set the table, lit candles, and even played soft jazz because I thought it would make them feel more at home. They arrived 40 minutes late. Dad walked in and said, "Place looks expensive. Hope your mortgage isn't bleeding you dry." Mom gave a half smile and said, "You really don't need 2 bedrooms, do you?" And Brian. He walked straight into the second room, opened the closet, tested the chair at my desk, and said, "This would make a perfect workspace." I thought he was joking. He wasn't. He looked me dead in the eye and said, "You're barely even here most of the time. I could make real progress if I had a place like this." I forced a laugh and changed the subject. But the seed was planted. A few days later, Mom called. "Your brother's in a rough spot again. He's thinking of starting another venture and just needs some space to focus. Maybe you could help, just for a few months." I stayed silent. So she added, "You're always alone there anyway. Don't you think it'd be nice to have family close by?" That question stayed with me longer than it should have. Not because I didn't know the answer, but because I finally realized they never saw this home as mine. They saw it as Brian's next opportunity. They saw me as the stepping stone to get him there. And for the first time, I didn't just feel tired. I felt done. I didn't respond to Mom's request that day. I told her I'd think about it, which in our family was code for, "I'm too afraid to say no outright." She took it as a yes. Over the next few weeks, the language around the suggestion began to shift. First it was, "Brian just needs a quiet space to get through this phase." Then it became, "You're barely using that second bedroom anyway." And finally, "Maybe we can move some of his things over this weekend, just to get him settled." I hadn't agreed to anything. But it was like that didn't matter anymore. In their minds, my silence was permission, and my space was community property. At first, I tried to hold the line politely. I said I was too busy. I said work was stressful. But what I really meant was, I'm tired of being volunteered for things I didn't sign up for. Then came the guilt campaign. At Sunday dinner, one of the few I still attended, my aunt leaned across the table and said, "It must feel amazing to have your own place at your age. Your parents must be so proud." Before I could answer, Mom chimed in, "We're proud of both our children, especially the way Lynn is helping her brother get back on his feet." I nearly dropped my fork. Later that night, I texted her, "I haven't agreed to let Brian stay here. Please stop telling people I have." She responded with, "Ma just assumed you would. He's family, Lena. And family helps each other." That word again, family, used like a crowbar, prying open every boundary I'd ever tried to set. A few days later, I came home from work and found Brian standing in the lobby of my building. He held a duffel bag in one hand and a keyboard in the other. "Hey," he said casually. "Mom said you were cool with it. Just for a couple of weeks, right?" I froze. He was already pressing the elevator button before I could speak, already acting like the decision had been made. "You can't just show up like this," I said. "I never said yes." He shrugged. "You didn't say no either." That was the moment I realized they had all been counting on that I'd avoid conflict. That I'd cave, like I always had. I didn't let him upstairs. I stood there, exhausted, cornered, trembling. But I didn't move. He finally left, muttering something about how I'd changed. He was right. I had. That weekend, I skipped family dinner. I needed space. Time to think. But the absence triggered alarms. By Monday morning, I had 5 missed calls from Mom, 2 from Dad, and 1 from a number I didn't recognize. Turns out it was Brian using a friend's phone because I'd muted his. Then came the group texts. From my uncle, my cousin, and even my godmother in Arizona. All variations of the same message. "He's your brother. Just help him. It's not forever. Don't turn your back on your own blood." And the worst one. from my father. You live in a luxury apartment thanks to the values we taught you. The least you can do is share. I stared at that message for a long time. What values were those, exactly? The ones that told me to abandon my needs for someone else's convenience. The ones that praised Brian for failing upward and called me selfish for drawing a line. Because if that's what they'd taught me, then unlearning those values might have been the most valuable thing I'd ever done. I should have trusted my gut and skipped Brian's birthday dinner. But I didn't. Mom insisted it would be a simple gathering. Just family, she said. Nothing dramatic. She even promised, this isn't about the apartment. Just come for your brother. Be civil. So I went. I wore a soft gray dress, neutral, modest. I kept my jewelry minimal and my makeup light. I'd gotten good at shrinking myself just enough to avoid comments. But as soon as I stepped through the door, I knew something was off. The dining room had been rearranged to fit 20 chairs. A printed, Happy 35th, Brian banner hung across the back wall. My mom's finest china was out. The good wine was breathing. This wasn't a dinner. It was a stage production. And I was the unwitting audience. I found my seat near the end of the table, beside a cousin I barely remembered and opposite my aunt, who always said, "You're so serious, Lena. You should smile more. You have a nice face when you use it." Brian sat at the head of the table, grinning like a man who'd already won something. Mom hovered nearby, touching his shoulder every few minutes. Dad poured his wine like it was communion. Dinner was mostly polite, forced. Conversations circled around weather, traffic, the usual. But the tension was thick, like everyone was waiting for the second act to begin. And it did, right after cake. Dad stood, tapped his spoon to his glass, and cleared his throat. "I know we're all here to celebrate Brian today, but there's something important we want to discuss as a family." That word again, family. Always a prelude to an ambush. I stiffened in my seat. Mom joined him, standing at his side, her hands clasped together like she was about to pray. "As you all know," she began, "Brian's been working so hard to get his new venture off the ground. But it's not easy out there these days. Not with rent prices and the economy." Sympathetic nods rippled across the table. I sat still, eyes fixed on the untouched slice of cake in front of me. "He just needs a stable environment," Dad continued. "A space where he can focus, reset, build something meaningful. And then, Lena has that space. A beautiful under-roofed apartment. And we think this is an opportunity to support each other the way families are supposed to." The room went quiet. No one looked at me. Because they all already knew. This wasn't a conversation. It was a presentation. And the final slide was my home on offer. "It wouldn't be forever," Mom said sweetly. "Just until things stabilize for him. He could use the second bedroom as an office. Lena works long hours anyway. She's hardly there." I didn't speak. I wanted to. But I was so stunned, so exposed, that my words scattered like marbles on tile. Brian chimed in then, trying to sound humble. "I'd keep to myself. Respect the space. Honestly, it just makes sense. It's family, right?" That broke the spell. I stood up slowly, pushing my chair back without apology. "No," I said, my voice shaking. "It does not make sense." Everyone turned. I didn't agree to this. I've said no, multiple times. You all knew that. And yet here we are, pretending this is a group decision. Mom's face hardened. "Don't make a scene, Lena. We're just talking." "No, you're not. You're cornering me. In front of a room full of people, so I'd feel too guilty to push back." "We're offering a solution," Dad said firmly. "You have space. He needs it. What's the problem?" "The problem is you don't see me. You see a resource, a backup plan, a safety net for Brian that you didn't build." I did. Brian leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. "Wall. So all that money, that education, and you still don't get what it means to be part of a family." "No, Brian," I snapped. "I get it better than anyone. I've been expected to carry the emotional and financial weight of this family for years. And every time I set a boundary, you act like it's betrayal." A few murmurs rose across the table. My aunt muttered, "She's always been a bit cold." I turned to her, voice like ice. "No, I've just been quiet. There's a difference." Mom stepped forward then, her voice trembling. Not with sadness, but fury. "You're ungrateful, after everything we've done for you." "What have you done for me, exactly?" I said. "I paid for my own education. I've worked every job I've ever had. I saved for that apartment while you poured thousands into Brian's hobbies. What, exactly, do you think I owe you?" Silence. Real, heavy silence. And then I said it, the line I never thought I'd say aloud. "He will not be moving into my home. Not now. Not ever." I turned, picked up my coat, and walked out the front door. Nobody followed, not even Mom. I thought walking out would bring relief, and for a moment, it did. That night, I sat in my apartment, curled up on the couch with a glass of wine, staring out at the skyline. For the first time in years, I'd said exactly what I meant. But peace doesn't last long when your family's used to ignoring boundaries. By the next morning, my phone had exploded. 17 missed calls, 12 text messages, 3 voicemails from mom. Mom, you embarrassed us in front of everyone. You walked out on your brother's birthday. How do you think that made him feel? Mom, this is not how I raised you. Then came the messages from others. Dad, your mother is in tears. She hasn't slept. Was your point really worth that much pain? Uncle Ron, we'll all sacrifice in families. You don't get to just opt out when it's inconvenient. Aunt Denise, you've changed, Lena, and not in a good way. But the one that gutted me, because it came from someone I used to trust, was from my cousin Lila. You didn't have to humiliate them. A simple no would have sufficed. But you had to make a scene. We used to look up to you. I didn't reply to any of them. Not because I didn't have words, but because I knew none of mine would matter in a room where the script had already been written. I wasn't the dutiful daughter anymore. I wasn't the reliable one. Now I was selfish, ungrateful, cruel, for protecting my home, for protecting myself. 2 days later, the narrative expanded. From private text to public shame. Brian posted a picture of his birthday cake with the caption, "Bittersweet birthday." Some people would rather hold on to square footage than hold space for family. Underneath were comments from extended relatives and family friends. "So sorry, Brian. You deserve better. You'll rise above this. Proud of you for staying gracious." Sad how success makes some people forget where they came from. My name wasn't mentioned, but it didn't need to be. I was the only one with square footage. I showed the post to Rebecca over coffee. She read it, then looked up slowly. "You know this isn't about the apartment, right?" "It never was. This is about control." You said no, for once, and they panicked. That post. It's not just guilt tripping, it's a warning to fall back in line. I nodded, staring down at my untouched laddie. "So what do I do now?" She didn't hesitate. "You hold the line, and you make it louder if you have to." The next day, I did something I'd never done before. I wrote a letter. Not to my family, but to myself. I listed everything I'd contributed over the years. The birthday gifts I bought for Brian when he was unemployed. The groceries I stocked for mom and dad during the pandemic. The money I sent is, just until next month. I read it out loud. Then I deleted every chat thread with them. I didn't block them. Not yet, but I needed silence. That silence didn't last long. The following weekend, the building concierge buzzed me. "Ms. Hartley, your parents are downstairs. They say it's urgent." I froze. "Do they have an appointment?" "No, ma'am." "Then please tell them I'm not available. And make a note. They are not to be let up without my consent." "Understood." I stood behind the peephole 20 minutes later, watching as my parents left the lobby. Mom clutched a tissue like it was part of her costume. Dad's jaw was tight, eyes sweeping the building like he owned it. They didn't ring the bell. They didn't look up, but I felt them, like a storm pressing against my windows. That night, an envelope slid under my door. No name, no return address, just thick ivory paper, and inside a single sheet. "We didn't raise you to be this heartless. If you don't come home and make this right, don't expect to be welcomed again. Anywhere. Ever." No signature, but the handwriting was unmistakable. My mother. I sat on the floor, letter in hand, and for once, I didn't cry. I laughed. Not because it was funny, but because I'd finally reached the end of the script. The scene where the daughter is threatened with exile if she refuses to abandon herself. Except I'd already made peace with exile. If the cost of staying was self-erasure, then walking away wasn't rebellion, it was survival. Weeks passed. Not a single call, not a single knock on my door. For the first time in my adult life, my phone was silent, not with rejection, but with relief. At first, I didn't know what to do with all that quiet. No guilt-trip voicemails, no last-minute demands, no pressure to be everything for everyone, just space. So I filled it with my own voice. I started waking up early, not to squeeze in more work, but to walk along the waterfront. I bought flowers for no reason. I rearranged my apartment, with warm lighting and soft linen drapes. I turned the second bedroom, the one they tried to take, into a reading room. A sanctuary, not for clients, not for guests, just for me. One evening, Rebecca and I sat on the floor of that room, surrounded by open books and candles. She held up a mug of tea and clinked it gently against mine. "To silence that isn't emptiness," she said, "but sovereignty." I smiled. "To peace that doesn't need permission." We laughed. Then we sat there quietly. And it was enough. I began reconnecting with the world, with myself, and, slowly, with people who actually saw me. People like Jamila from the architecture firm, who invited me to lead a mentorship circle for first-gen designers. People like my neighbor upstairs, who turned out to be a photographer with a love for rooftop stargazing and existential jokes. And, surprisingly, people like my cousin Lila, the same one who had once texted, "You didn't have to make a scene." She reached out 1 month after the birthday dinner. Leela, I want to say I'm sorry. For assuming. For judging. Can we talk? I didn't respond right away. Not because I was angry, but because I needed to be sure I wasn't responding out of habit. Eventually, I said yes. We met at a quiet coffee shop downtown, where I watched her twist her ring for 5 whole minutes before she spoke. I've been thinking about what happened, she said, and about what's happened to me. She told me about her own silent struggles with our family, how she once declined to host Thanksgiving and was called selfish, how she moved cities without telling anyone just to breathe. I didn't stand up for you, she said, and I should have, because I know what it's like to be the reasonable one everyone leans on until you break. We didn't fix everything in that conversation, but we started something new, not based on blood, but in truth. Months later, something else arrived quietly, unexpectedly. An email. From Dad. Subject line, no pressure, just words. He wrote about the night of the birthday dinner. He said he didn't agree with how I left, but he understood now why I left. Your mother still believes what she did was right, he wrote. But I've been thinking a lot since then. About fairness. About silence. About the ways we raised you to absorb what we never dared question ourselves. He didn't ask for a call. He didn't ask to meet. He just said, if one day you're open to a cup of coffee, I'd like to sit across from you. Not as your father demanding respect, but as a man who's learning how to offer it. I stared at the screen for a long time, and for the first time, I didn't feel obligated to reply. But I didn't feel angry either. I felt something softer, like the door hadn't been kicked down, just gently unlatched. 6 months after the fallout, I hosted a dinner party in my home, not for family, for chosen family. Rebecca, Jamila, my neighbor Ely, a few junior architects I now mentored. We ate, we laughed, and we argued about book covers and design philosophy. And when the sky turned dark, we moved to the balcony, where the city lights flickered beneath us like stars we could finally name. As the night slowed, Rebecca leaned over and whispered, "So, would you ever let me move into your spare room?" I smirked. "Only if you bring better wine." She grinned. "Fair." Later, when everyone had gone home, I walked through the apartment. No shadows in the corners. No heaviness in the air. Just moonlight on the walls. I stood in the center of my space, hands on the edge of my desk, and realized something: they didn't win. Not because I fought harder, but because I stopped fighting for their approval. I stopped auditioning for a family that only valued me when I stayed small, and in that surrender, I found everything I was looking for. Respect. Quiet. Peace. Not the kind they give you when you behave. The kind you claim when you finally say, "This is mine, and I am enough."